Thank you for joining me today. I'm having a few audio problems, but I think I got them worked out, so hang in there. I was looking into mental wards and sanatoriums, and yeah, I missed a connection on those mental wards, and I've been trying to update my files. I've got about a dozen files I'm trying to share with you while I'm still here on the game board. So I was looking into mental wards, and then I was looking into sanatoriums, because those sanatoriums seemed pretty dangerous. They had a pretty high death rate. And then I stumbled on tuberculosis. Lo and behold, that was the reason why people got sent away to sanatoriums to rest from the TB. And I was reading along about these sanatoriums and blah, 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 blah. And then I get to the part about the symptoms, and I thought, oh, wait a minute here. These symptoms sound exactly like sulfur. And lo and behold, likely is. So pull up a chair, we got some talking to do today. So, before I get started, I'd like to point out there's a site that I posted down below called Wise Uranium. Lots of uranium mining going on all over the world. A tremendous reference site, so that's posted down below. So anyway, so what happens likely is this, is that you get TB, right? You probably don't die from the TB. You probably die from the heart attack, because severe or chronic TB significantly increases the risk of fatal cardiac events, and many TB-related deaths are ultimately recorded as heart attacks rather than tuberculosis. So, heart attack and heart disease, the number leading global killer. TB is not the leading killer, but it ranks really, really high in some countries. It raises cardiovascular mortality. It hides inside heart attack statistics. And it is structurally misattributed in death records. Yeah, and the exact same symptoms. So before I get started, I've got a couple of things I want to cover. Going on in Iran, that Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, he definitely 100% connects to Israel. Not a good person. I could not find much on him. His finances are pretty well hidden. They claim that he's making about $700,000 to $1 million from social media, but that really isn't records. I mean, it's just what somebody says, right? And Mossad has been bragging about the riots in Iran. So 100% full stop, Iran is behind all of the riots, not all of them, but taking place in Iran right now. And they're trying to push this monarch, Reza Pahlavi, and he is out there saying, well, we got to have a civil war. Anyway, the guy is a complete and 100% stooge of Israel. And also in the news, I'm telling you, you got to start going after these people. They're ready to boil down and burn. Trump was at a Ford auto worker plant, and he flipped the bird. In other words, he gave the middle finger to a worker during a visit. So he was visiting a Ford plant in Michigan, and the worker's name was T.J. Sabula. He was a 40-year-old line worker at the Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, and he was a member of the United Auto Workers, Local 600. And Sabula shouted at Trump, reportedly calling him a pedophile protector, before Trump reacted with a gesture and a profane remark. Sabula has since been suspended from his job pending an internal investigation, but he just didn't randomly shout this out in the crowd. Let's be clear about that. There was booing going on before he even shouted the insult. The atmosphere was already controversial. The incident occurred in a non-rally, real workplace setting. So, yeah, he basically, just said what he had to say. And if more people would say what they had to say, this thing would have a whole different direction. But that's all I'm going to say. And they're also talking about firing Powell. Well, they can't fire Powell. And what I've done is, for this show, I've rounded up everything I've been yapping about. The IRS is not a U.S. government agency. It is an agency of the IMF. All of this stuff will be down below for you to take a look at. There's an article I found called "The Federal Reserve, the Enemy of America." They can't fire Powell, and they all know it. All those yap talking heads on social media, a lot of them are lawyers themselves. You really think they don't know what's going on? So anyhow, how does this all fit in? Well, I think what we're looking at is around the Gilded Age. I've been saying this for a long time. The Gilded Age came along, and I believe the people that were here before were in fact Muslims that built those big houses, and they knew the harm of electricity. And then after the Gilded Age came the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was 100% all about eugenics. So anyhow, that's what belief I'm going on, because I was looking at, when I did a show, I don't know, it's been a few years ago, about the type of mental wards they were building in this country. And they seem to have some Italian motif in them. You know, these kids were really good when they were going through these mental hospitals, and they were pointing out different things. And one of them pointed out some Italian tile in one of these buildings. And I kept thinking, where does Italy fit in with this? And so then these same kids, it's called urban explorers, and they go around and they look at old buildings and stuff. And these kids were from the United States. And so then what they did was they did a collaboration with some urban explorers over in Europe. And for some reason, they started exploring these Italian mental institutions. And those mental institutions are still emblazoned in my brain today because they were so brutal. And I kept thinking, what is the connection from Italy? Well, come to find out there was a connection, and I have that today. So let me just get going here. So before migration, pre-migration, there was confinement infrastructure. And there was also an Italian-American psychiatric convergence during that time. That was a piece that I was missing. So, how it all worked was this. They have these hospitals in this country called Kirkbridge, K-I-R-K, Bridge Hospitals. And the Kirkbridge Hospitals started construction around 1845 to 1885. And then, of course, the major U.S. immigration was 1880 to 1914. So as you can see, these Kirkbridge mental institutions were conveniently built right before the mass immigration. And then the Italian mass immigration peak was 1890 to 1910s. So these Kirkbride, I have to pronounce this right, Kirkbride hospitals were planned, funded, and built before the demographic pressures they labored. So before they got their people here, this was not a reaction to immigration. This was pre-existing containment capacity. So the Kirkbride model assumed long-term or lifelong residence. The model is associated with Thomas Story Kirkbridge, rested on explicit assumptions: long-term or permanent confinement, strict separation by sex, diagnosis, and behavior, centralized medical authority with total spatial control, moral order imposed through architecture. So they basically had these architectural features. They had linear batwing wings that extended from a central authority. So they had like a building in the front, which was actually quite elaborate and stuff. And then off of that, they built these other things, which were the quarters and the different places where the people exit. But it was actually called planned warehousing, okay? Because all these Kirkbrides were built before mass demographic change. So, because during the Kirkbride build-out, the U.S. population was overwhelmingly native-born, Anglo-Protestant, and rural or small town. Large-scale European and Southern immigration had not yet begun. Urban industrial slums had not yet peaked. So the target populations for these Kirkbride facilities were the rural poor, the social non-conforming, the disabled, the mentally ill as defined by 19th century norms. So later populations that immigrated were inserted into this already built systems. So Kirkbride functions as a baseline control system. Because Kirkbride hospitals predate mass migration, they reveal where the state already expected problem populations, also where it invested in long-term institutional capacity, and it also showed us how later immigrant flows were absorbed without redesign or consent. So when the immigration increased, admissions surged, overcrowding exploded. Linguistics and cultural differences were medicalized. Foreigners blended with diagnosis of degeneracy or insanity. So new populations coming to this country did not create the institutions. They were processed by them because they were already built, and that is very key to understanding all of this. So let me keep scrolling along here. So Kirkbride hospitals demonstrate that the United States built a nationwide system of long-term confinement before mass migration occurred. And everything I'm saying, you can take a look at my website. I have a huge list of resources at the bottom. Every little word coming out of my mouth today has been, in fact, all proven to be true. None of this today is, in fact, speculation. So then I started winding back and looking at the Italians. Both the American and the Italian systems descend from early mid-19th century under European psychiatry. They had several different things going on. They had the French moral treatment, they had the British reform, the German institutional medicine, and the Enlightenment classification impulses. So Italy was not the exporter of asylum reform. Be very clear about that. It was largely a receiver and preserver of older custodian forms. So the United States selectively formalized and monumentalized these ideas through the architecture. So let's take a look at the Kirkbride hospitals and the Italian asylums. Well, in Italy, they basically reused monasteries, prisons, and estates. They were overtly brutal. They were custodian confinement, visible suffering, and those places are brutal from what I could tell. But in the United States, those hospitals were built on purpose. They used therapeutic language, got rid of the overt brutality. They used moral treatment confinement, and they sanitized the suffering. So basically, removal from public life was a goal. Normalization of long-term disappearance of people. Acceptance of high morality. Conversion of social problems into medical ones. So, yeah, all of the ideas, they came from Italy, the actual implication. And here's how it worked. This was the part that I was missing. It's called the Lombroso, Lombroso pivot. Italian influence enters after Kirkbride construction through theory, not architecture. There was a man named Cesare Lombroso. He claimed that criminality and insanity are innate. He claimed that degeneration is hereditary. And you'll notice that all of these things, from everything from being a psychopath to getting diseases, they always want to pin it on hereditary, right? Blame the victim, right? And that included certain populations that were biologically predisposed to deviance. In other words, if you had family members who they deemed deviant, well, you might get hauled in yourself. So here's how it worked. The Kirkbridge hospitals were built between 1845 and 1885. And this Lombroso person publishes this thing from 1876 onward. So right in the middle, okay? So Lombroso supplied a new justification for keeping people there permanently. Yeah, rely on the Italians, right? I have my own theory about the Italians, but not for this second. So Lombroso changed the U.S. without really rebuilding anything, because what he did was he did reinterpretation, not reconstruction. So before Lombroso, for example, the moral treatment rhetoric, it was called biological determination. And the hope of care, in other words, pretty dire. After Lombroso, the presumption of incurability, like you're never going to leave this place. And before Lombroso, there was this feeling about social deviance. And after Lombroso, it switched to genetic defect. Blame your parents, right? And before Lombroso, it was just to get you in custody. After Lombroso, it was to the public protection. Yeah, protect that public. So Lombroso did not design institutions, he actually hardened them. So Italy's institutional violence remained visible long enough to face reckoning. And there was a movement that they later on, around 1978, Franco Basaglia, all psychiatry asylums were abolished and blah blah blah. So Italy is the only Western nation to fully break the asylum system. The U.S., by contrast, closed institutions piecemeal and redistributed confinement into prisons, nursing homes, and for the homeless. And I'm going to be doing a show down the road about homeless in America, which you will, in fact, want to pay attention to, because all of this will feed into that. The goal is to lock us up. So, anyhow, Kirkbride was an American completely built before the mass immigration. The Italian influence entered later through Lombroso's theories, which biologized and hardened confinement. So anyway, so that's how this person gets in the picture here. And I pulled up an example. There was a big place called Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. These buildings are humongous. I'm talking huge. So Danvers, I'm using as my test case. Danvers State Hospital is analytically clean because the construction was in 1874, which was squarely within the Kirkbride build-out. The architect included classic Kirkbride plan, and it was purpose-built. And it was built before mass Southern Eastern European immigration. And there's records, extensive surviving admission books, case files, and annual reports. So because of this, that makes Danville a pretty good place to take a look at. So let's take a look at some of the languages, the early records from the 1870s to the 1880s when they were doing the moral treatment framework. The dominant language in the patient records were things like melancholia, mania, exhaustion, intemperance, domestic trouble, overwork, grief. So characterizations of this phase: causes framed as situation or moral. Length of stay was often described as temporary, and the discharge outcomes included wording like improved, recovered, relieved. So even though confinement was long, the official rhetoric presumed curability at first. So then we have a shift in the 1890s to the 1910s when the immigration meets an existing system. So by the 1890s, admissions increasingly included Italians, Irish, Eastern European Jewish, Polish. And on the patient ledgers, they began listing things like nationality, parentage, nativity of parents. This was a structural pivot. The institutions did not change, the population did. So then there was a diagnostic shift from the 1890s to the 1920s, and that was where Lombrosian logic, without Lombrosian's name. So new or rising diagnostic categories in some of these Danvers records use words like dementia precox, feeble-mindedness, psychopathic personality, constitutional inferiority, defective delinquent. So basically, the Lombros concept went from innate criminality to psychopathic personality. They went from hereditary degeneration to feeble-mindedness. So yeah, they made a big shift also in the language. So what they did was they just basically started hardening the language. Earlier files, there were variable stays, frequent discharge attempts. Later files repeated language of things like unimprovable, no insight, defective judgment, unsafe for community. These are Lombrosian conclusions expressed in American clinical language. So, and then under the family history, case files increasingly started to note insanity in mother, alcoholic father, defective siblings, foreign-born parents. So family background is no longer context, it becomes the ethnology. So race or ethnicity is rarely named as a cause, but immigrants are overrepresented in feeble-mindedness, dementia, psychopathic personality. Native-born patients remain more likely to receive situational diagnosis, shorter confinement. This is how race persists without a period in the diagnosis. So the building stayed the same, the ward stayed the same, the legal commitment process stayed the same. The meaning changed. The Kirkbride Hospital becomes from a place of moral restoration to a mechanism for managing biologically dangerous populations. That shift is the Lombroso effect, layered into pre-existing infrastructure. So at Danvers State Hospital, the adoption of biologically deterministic diagnosis after 1890 transformed an already built Kirkbride institution from a nominally curative asylum into a mechanism for permanent segregation, disproportionately applied to immigrant and socially marginal populations. I have a relative, my mother discovered them. They were, it was on my mother's side, so they were in Montana, and she was my mother's great aunt, I believe, and she had been confined to a mental institution, the one there in Montana. And I talked about this when I did the show about Montana ages ago. And she was unusual because, well, actually my mother found her gravesite, they found her records, and they found out that she had been murdered while she was in that institution. And I think how the story went was that somebody just didn't like her, and she was a sensitive person, so they said, hey, she's crazy, lock her up. And that's pretty much how it all happened back then. So, anyhow, so I think we get the picture because across Europe, especially before the mid-19th century, facilities for the mentally ill were not purpose-built hospitals. They were typically converted monasteries or convents, former prisons or workhouse houses, poorhouses or almshouses. And they also had plague isolation facilities and medieval hospitals originally intended for charity or custody. And this pattern was widespread in Italy, Spain, parts of France, and the Habsburg lands in Austria and Hungary and southern Germany. These buildings in Europe were designed for segregation, enclosure, and control, not for treatment. And boy, were they brutal. I'll try to remember to put a link down below. So, Europe reused old buildings. European states already had centuries-old systems for managing the poor, the sick, the criminal, and the socially disruptive. So madness was folded into existing custodial infrastructure, not separated out as a new medical problem requiring new architecture. So many European countries centralized late, had uneven national standards, lacked political consensus for large new public works. Because, Italy unified only in 1861. Yeah, only in 1861, not that long ago. So, in much of Catholic Europe, insanity was long framed as moral failure, sin, possession, dangerous disorder requiring isolation. This justified confinement for solutions, well suited to monasteries and prisons already built for withdrawal from society. Even where reform occurred, buildings often did not change. France is instructive. Institutes, they used medieval or early modern complexes. They reinterpreted it under moral treatment. They were rarely built from scratch. So, patients remained in spaces designed for custody, surveillance, and discipline. So, Italy is my clearest example. In Italy, psychiatric asylums were commonly former monasteries, former prisons, converted charitable institutions. They were overcrowded, architecturally punitive, long-term by default. Italy did not undertake a nationwide program of purpose-built asylum construction comparable to the U.S. Kirkbride movement. This is why Italian institutions appear especially brutal in retrospect. They never hid what they were. But the United States made a deliberate break from the European pattern. Under reformers like Thomas Story Kirkbride, American states argued that, we are not medieval, we are scientific. We build new institutions to prove it. So they built them on new land, new buildings, new architectural. So Europe largely reused custody. The U.S. repackaged custody as medicine. There's a couple of clarifications. Late 19th century pavilion hospitals in Germany. There's some new construction in France and Britain. However, these were uneven, often partial, rarely replaced older custodial complexes wholesale. Reuse remained the dominant pattern well into the 20th century. So European mental hospitals were very often old buildings, repurposed from monasteries, prisons, and poorhouses. This reflects a long tradition of custodial confinement rather than a medicalized break. The United States, of course, diverged by building purpose-made asylums to signal reform and modernity, even while preserving the same underlying function. So, in much of Europe, psychiatric institutions developed by repurposing existing monasteries, prisons, and poorhouses rather than through purpose-built hospitals, architecture, reflecting a continuity of custodial confinement that the United States later sought to obscure through new construction. So, tuberculosis. Let's get to tuberculosis here. I would have to call this a backflip moment for me. I had two backflip moments. That's what I call them. I have them very rarely. And what do I mean by a backflip moment? When I literally feel like I've kind of lost my bearings for a bit. When I got to the part of this story about tuberculosis and the symptoms, I actually literally froze in time and did a backflip. Tuberculosis was real. It killed millions. Doctors treated it. Governments built hospitals for it. But something else was going on. Industrial air, especially sulfur, was damaging lungs long before people were diagnosed with TB. What happened was they disappeared the responsibility, not through denial, not through conspiracy, but through paperwork. Once tuberculosis or TB was written on the record, everything that came before it stopped existing in law. This episode today is going to be about TB, sulfur, and the backflip trick they pulled. How mass harm can be acknowledged, treated, and recorded while causation is quietly erased. So just by looking at a simple thing, I was looking into sanatoriums and mental hospitals, and here we are now. Eugenics as part of the history of TB and public health. In the late 19th and 20th century, eugenics and public health were overlapping moments, especially in the United States and Europe. Very important to know, the public health and eugenics were intertwined. Many early public health leaders borrowed ideas from eugenic thinkers, and some eugenicists treated infectious diseases like tuberculosis as part of their broader project of improving the health of the populations. Eugenics and public health were never separate in this country. Historians have documented that eugenics was not a fringe idea, but influenced mainstream public health in the early 20th century. Eugenic approaches often are borrowed public health techniques to justify policies aimed at shaping the population, and many public health figures saw disease control and population improvement as connected goals. And keep in mind, I went over all of this. All of those fancy universities, Stanford, all of them were started on the basis of eugenics. It just didn't fly out of the air. A scholarly essay specifically on eugenic attempts to eliminate tuberculosis in progressive era America actually explored how eugenic ideas were applied to infectious diseases like TB. This work shows that some advocates treated TB not only as a medical condition, but as part of a larger set of hereditary and population health concerns. Some early 20th century researchers, including those motivated by eugenics, conducted disease studies that blended heredity and environmental explanations. For example, Raymond Pearl, and he's also, I think they're related to that Pearl Bailey, but anyway, an influential figure in early public health, studied tuberculosis in the context of hereditary and genetics, reflecting eugenic assumptions about improving population health. Well, the only way they could get this through would be to blame our families, right? Well, you came from a very bad family. You know, your dad was an alcoholic. Your mom seems kind of crazy. You got a couple nutcase cousins over there. We think you're crazy. So, the broader social hygiene movement. And if any of you guys can add, okay, just think about this for a second, okay? My mother was born in 1926, okay? I was born in 1951. In the 1920s, all of this was going on. None of this was hidden. They did tours around this country talking about eugenics. It was a big, big deal. Not some hidden fringe kind of a deal. So the broader social hygiene movement, which included efforts to combat TB venereal disease, alcoholism, and mental illness was frequently allied with eugenics thinking. Many social hygienists believed that disease and social problems could be addressed by shaping individual behavior and population characteristics. You know, you got to write something down, right? You can't just say, hey, we decided that we want to murder all these people, these no good people that we let into this country, so what are we going to do? Hey, I got an idea. Let's act like we're going to help them out. Why do I always say evil has to come packaged as help, right? So is calling it eugenics at the root? Is this about eugenics? Yes and no. Scholars caution that eugenics was not a single, unified cause underpinning all public health. It took many forms, some more explicit than others. Ideas of heredity, fitness, and social worth were woven into public health thinking without always taking the racist or coercive extremes later associated with Nazi ideology. Well, actually, you know, the truth be told, the Nazis learned their most brutal techniques from the United States. They all connect. Don't try to kid yourself on some of this stuff, okay? Denial is really not a good deal when you're looking for the truth. So, many leaders in every early public health were deeply influenced by eugenics ideas. Policies and disease narratives sometimes reflected a belief that health was tied to hereditary fitness as such, or more than environment or workplace conditions. So yeah, a belief that health was tied to hereditary. How often have we heard that? TB and other diseases were often framed in language that overlapped with eugenics thinking about weakness, defect, or unfit, which influenced how the public and legal systems then responded. This doesn't mean that modern TB control was consciously genocidal, but it does mean that eugenics logic shaped the assumptions and priorities of public health in exactly the era that I have been analyzing. So, in summary, what do the historians say? Well, eugenics and public health were interwoven historically. Eugenic methods often used public health models and shared goals about population health. Scholars have documented eugenics attempts to influence TB policy and ideas about disease and heredity in the early 20th century America. The social hygiene movement merged disease control with population level moral and biological ideas, overlapping with eugenics thinking. So in the early 20th century, not that long ago, public health and eugenics were deeply interconnected. Some disease theories and policies, including around tuberculosis, were shaped by eugenics ideas about hereditary fitness and population health, influencing both scientific framing and social policy. So let's take a basic look at the timeline. We have the Gilded Age, the 1870s to the 1900s, an era that I would say all heck broke loose. Somebody got tossed out of those big homes and somebody took over, and that somebody are the same people today. I've done an extensive timeline that I'm hoping I will get to about what generation of these people we're dealing with. I am not guessing here. I will back up all of this as soon as I can, but let's just go for right now with what I have in front of me. So the Gilded Age, 1870s to 1900s. Now, what this also means is the people who took over around the Gilded Age, according to me, could have been in this country for a very long time. The Gilded Age was when they got the jump on those Muslims and tossed them out of those homes. That was an era of rapid industrialization, extreme wealth concentration, railroad, steel, mining, and oil booms, minimal regulation, urban crowding, pollution, and industrial injury, and massive labor exploitation. And right after the Gilded Age came the Progressive Era, 1890 to the early 1920s, when my mother was barely still alive, barely being born. So Progressive Era, the reform movement reacting to Gilded Age harms, public health expansion, sanitation, housing reform, food safety, labor regulation, well, partial, growth of state power and administration. This is overlap, not a hard cutoff. The same people, institutions, and industries carry straight through this time. The Progressive Era did not dismantle the industrial system of the Gilded Age. It tried to manage its consequences. They were feeding people like formaldehyde in tins of food and killing people aggressively because they just wanted to make money. So they had no standards during the whole Gilded Age. And supposedly the Progressive Era was to get all that reeled back into right. But remember, their first thought during the Gilded Age was to harm as many of us as they possibly could, right? Get everybody working for cheap to no labor. And don't even get me started on the children. I'll be getting back to that. So they tried to manage the consequences, and this is where public health, record keeping, and classifications explode in importance. So progressive reform, the help and control. Progressive reforms did some real good. They came up with clean water systems, sewer construction, food and drug regulation, TB sanatoriums were built, workplace safety laws, well, they were limited, but they tried, right? But they also shifted from the focus from industry to populations. They framed disease as susceptibility and behavior. They expanded surveillance and record systems. They classified people as fit or unfit, compliant or non-compliant. This is where the eugenics thinking fits. Eugenics belongs to the Progressive Era. It is often misunderstood. Eugenics was not a primary robber baron ideology. It was a reform era technology ideology. It appealed to professionals, doctors, statisticians, planners, and administrators. Whereas eugenics promised scientific management of society, reduction of social costs, prevention rather than redistribution, population improvement without confronting capital. This made it attractive to the progressives. So how does this connect directly to TB and sulfur? Well, during the Gilded Age, lungs were damaged by dust, smoke, sulfur, and overcrowding. TB mortality skyrocketed. Industry expanded without restraint. But during the Progressive Era, TB was aggressively managed. Sanatoriums proliferated. Records became standardized. Disease was classified and tracked. But crucially, industrial causation was rarely named. So no one ever named, where's this TB coming from, right? TB was framed as infection and susceptibility. Responsibility shifted to individuals and families. The tuberculosis era sits squarely at the transition between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. The lung damage was produced under Gilded Age industrial conditions. The classification, record keeping, and responsibility shifting occurred under Progressive Era reforms. People resist this framing because they remember the Progressive Era as benevolent, reformist, scientific, and humane. Acknowledging its role in managing harm without assigning responsibility feels uncomfortable. because it complicates the moral story. But historians increasingly agree that progressive reform expanded care and control. It reduced visible chaos while stabilizing industrial systems. It professionalized omissions. So the Gilded Age started producing the damage to everybody's lungs. The progressive era organized, classified, and absorbed that damage. So TB, sulfur exposure, and eugenics all sit at this exact hinge point, and that's why I've always said do a timeline. You find out more from doing a timeline than just sitting there and guessing, right? So let's go through TB, sulfur, and the administrative pivot. Before 1750, there was an endemic TB with no mass systems. Tuberculosis existed for thousands of years at low endemic levels, or so they say, right? I can't confirm any of this. Did it really exist for thousands of years? Who knows? But there were no mass institutions for TB or mental illness. Illness was handled privately or locally. There was no large-scale industrial lung damage, no centralized death records or standardized causes. So the pathogen existed, but there was no epidemic and no administrative machinery to manage the mass illness. So 1750s to 1820s, early industrialization, proto-Gilded Age conditions. Coal burning expands rapidly. Early mining, smelting, and mills. Enclosed workshops and poor ventilation. Rapid urban crowding. TB mortality begins to rise sharply among working age adults. See, isn't that funny? Working age adults. No kids yet, right? Huh? Maybe the kids weren't in those plants, right? And they used medical framing. They called it Phthisitis, Phthisisis, or wasting disease, or bad air, or constitution. So lung damage begins to scale, but the language is still descriptive and environmental. So 1820 to 1870, full industrial acceleration. This was a Gilded Age foundation. Railroads, steel, mining, smelting explode. Sulfur-rich coal becomes a dominant fuel. Smelter towns, mill cities, mining camps all expand. Urban TB mortality soars. Young workers die in large numbers. But those doctors, the ones with those two snakes on their logos, what they observe is this: TB clustering in industrial districts. Gee, I wonder why that was. Higher TB rates in miners, stone cutters, and textile workers. Smoke, dust, and irritant gases worsening lung disease. Gee, this is all starting to sound like sulfur. This is why I did the backflip, right? So, but industry is politically untouchable. No worker compensation systems existed. No environmental liability law existed. But the damage is visible. The cause is discussable. But responsibility is dangerous to name. So yeah, during the Gilded Age, I think that's when they produced the damage. They had all those coals and everything going on. TB facts by the late 1800s. 70 to 90% of urban infection rates. TB kills 25% of the adults in Europe. And it's the leading cause of death in U.S. cities. So what's the social response? Well, moralization of the disease. Romanticizing consumption. The blame shifted toward constitution, temperance, poverty, and behavior. So the Gilded Age created the lung damage and the political crisis, mass illness, without a safe defendant. So yes, so then the progressives came along and they organized, classified, and absorbed the damage from 1890s to the 1920s. They came up with public health departments, vital statistic systems, standardized death certificates, and I'll be getting more of those death certificates in a bit here. They came up with TB sanatoriums, housing codes, sanitation systems, disease surveillance. But they did not build comprehensive industrial air liability. They did not deal with worker exposure attribution. They did not deal with environmental causation in the death records. So TB during that era was reframed as an infectious disease, susceptibility problem, or a hygiene issue. The word air, AIR, became abstract, fresh versus stale, ventilation, mortality, not industry. So part of the eugenics logic was the population fitness, hereditary susceptibility, degeneracy narratives, social hygiene, cost of care calculations. So the progressive era does not undo Gilded Age harm. It makes it administratively manageable. All the polluting they were doing and stuff that they think they claim that they stopped during the progress, it just kept going. They just learned to dump pollutants into water and not get caught. That was all that really changed. When they came up with the systems for clean water and all that, they came up with ways to distort it and diffuse it. So it wasn't really an era of, oh, all these great things to help all of us out. No, it was an era to actually hide. It was kind of like, you see all over BPA free. Well, that was a big trick, right? Because when they got caught with the toxin BPA in our plastics and stuff, they were forced to take it out. Would they replace it with, well, something more toxic? So that way they can say, well, this is BPA free. Yeah, technically it sure is, but the harm is actually greater by what they replace it with. So you see how this starts to work, right? So let's talk about the sanatorium. That peak was 1900 to 1935, and that was all about causation, containment without causation. There were hundreds of TB sanatoriums built. Long-term isolation was normalized. Workers were removed from work sites. And here's what gets interesting. The records focus on weight. As I told you before, you get very, very thin when you're having sulfur poisoning, right? You lose all that weight because your organs need to take all that nutrient. So you have to eat. You get very, very thin. So they focused on weight, compliance, behavior, and rest. But would they stop focusing on, well, nothing about workplace air, nothing about smelter smoke, nothing about sulfur exposure, and nothing about any employer being responsible. So the death certificates would list things like tuberculosis, pneumonia, debility, and exhaustion. So then 1935 to 1955, they came up with antibiotics, and it kind of collapsed the industry. Streptomycin and TB mortality drops. For some reason, introducing antibiotics dropped the TB rates. I'm not sure exactly why, because antibiotics wouldn't drop your sulfur poisoning rate, so I don't really know. Big open question here. But during that period, the sanatoriums started to close en masse, but chronic lung damage remained. Neurological symptoms persisted. Alcohol use common among survivors. Work capacity was often destroyed. So no new framework exists for environmental injury, industrial lung damage, or long-term compensation. So they just figured out a way to not classify it so they'd be caught and had to pay for it, right? Then in the 1950s to the 1970s was called, I would call it the reclassification era. Psychiatry absorbs the remainder. So former TB patients appear as chronic bronchitis, emphysema, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, personality disorder, non-compliance. Excuse me. I'm really trying to talk, but the microphone has to be about an inch from my face. So, okay, so why does it matter calling all these people crazy, anxiety, depression, all this? Well, because psychiatry requires no external cause. Alcoholism became framed as personal. Lung damage became lifestyle or mental illness. They really have some good ways to reclassify this stuff, don't they? That's why they have all those lawyers. And when all those lawyers on social media are sitting there acting like they don't know what's going on, trust me, if I could figure this out, my entire background was in marketing in Silicon Valley. And here I am talking about sulfur and tuberculosis. If I can figure this out and all the horrible things about this country, the fact that it's not even it's a corporation, not even really a democracy, the IRS is really run by the UN, all this stuff, if you look past all of that stuff, what remains is a pretty crazy system, right? So what cannot be cured is renamed. What is renamed cannot be claimed. 1970s to the present, the pattern repeats. Different exposure, same structure. We have uranium mining, chemical plants, refineries, diesel corridors, modern air pollution. So TB still clusters where lungs are already damaged, housing is poor, industry is concentrated. But public health still emphasizes compliance, treatment adherence, individual behavior. Exposure remains secondary. So yes, the Gilded Age produced the damage, the sulfur, the dust, the smoke, the overcrowding. Progressive era organized the response, standardized records, absorbed harm without assigning cause. The sanatoriums and the psychiatrists, they removed people, they neutralized liability, they normalized disappearance. So yes, chronically and structurally, the Gilded Age produced the lung damage. The Progressive Era classified and absorbed it. TB became the name of death. Sulfur became background air. Eugenic logic made this shift respectable. All those people in those fancy white coats, yeah, listen to your doctor. TB, sulfur exposure, and eugenics administration sit exactly at that hinge point, no doubt about it, where industrial harm becomes medically real, legally invisible, and administratively permanent. So here's where the catch is, right? TB is not evenly distributed. In the U.S., TB deaths cluster in mining and extraction regions, urban industrial corridors, prisons and detention centers, indigenous communities, immigrant and low-income populations, and people with prior lung damage. So when TB looks rare nationally, it is concentrated, not random. TB gets displaced into other categories. TB survivors often die later from chronic lung disease, heart failure, stroke, cancer, infections following lung damage. And those deaths are counted as heart disease, COPD, pneumonia, and cancer, and never TB. TB frequently functions as an initiating injury, not the final label. So TB is still a leading killer globally. According to who you going to call at the World Health Organization, TB is the leading infectious cause of death worldwide. 10 million new cases per year. TB is minor now in the U.S., but TB is catastrophic globally. So, many TB-era survivors and exposure-damaged populations were later counted under heart disease, lung cancer, COPD, and stroke. Are you starting to see why I had a backflip here? Speaking of backflips, I'm going to have to put this on hold and take a break here. I will be back on the other side with more fun and happy news for all of you. Happy days are here again. Well, at least we're going to know what's killing us, right? So hang on there. Okay, I'm back. Let me see here. Okay, let's talk. I'm not going to be able to tell you every single number around the whole world because I'm not sure all these numbers are correct, but basically, globally, tuberculosis concentrate in specific regions. Mining, smelting, polluting. Yeah, so according to the World Health Organization, who are you going to call? About 85 to 90% of all TB cases occur in a small number of regions. In highest TB burden regions, South Asia. Countries with the highest TB burden, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. Because they have mining belts, they have iron ore, they have belt dense population cities, severe air pollution. India alone counts for 25 to 30% of global TB cases. Pretty bad, right? Countries with very high in Central Africa, South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, yeah, they have gold mining, all that mining going on. Everywhere you're going to see mining, you're going to see problems. So, because remember, it's that sulfur in the mines, right? Um, Countries with elevated TB and drug resistant TB. Yeah, I don't know where this drug business comes in because, yeah, I could take some antibiotics right now and it certainly wouldn't cure me. Maybe you have underlying things and the antibiotics seem to work. No, don't really know, but certainly that's a big open question. But so resistant TB, Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Georgia. Key features, all the mining, smelters, yep, prison labor systems. And I was wondering about people, why do people in prison have so much TB? Well, I don't know, maybe prisoners are locked up minors, right? Maybe the prisoners are part of the prison population is part of the mining population for some crazy reason. Don't really know. But they claim that East and Southeast Asia, China, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, yeah, same deal. So if you look for mining and stuff, you're going to find TB. Hmm. Kind of an interesting correlation, right? Not exactly like, well, it's random. So how could TB transmit to the rest of us if it's focused in mining areas? So mining workers have 3 to 10 times higher TB rates than the general population. Silica exposed miners have dramatically higher TB risk. Smelter and refinance towns show elevated TB mortality. Coal burning regions correlate with higher TB incident. The most consistent overlap with gold mining, coal mining, uranium mining, copper and cobalt mining, smelter and refining zones. So, public health literature usually states things like this: mining increases TB risk due to silica, dust, and crowding. What they don't say is this: that mining creates lung vulnerability, that institutional air preconditions populations for TB, that TB then absorbs the mortality label. And this keeps TB categorized as an infectious disease problem, a compliance issue, a treatment challenge, never an exposure driven disease. Because TB thrives where lungs are already damaged. Mining and industrial air injure the silica, cause chronic inflammation, impair macrophage response, scar lung tissue. That makes TB more likely to activate, more severe, harder to clear, and more deadly. So TB does not really arrive alone. It arrives when lungs are already compromised. So this same pattern repeats globally. Extraction economy creates lung damage. TB activates and spreads. TB is recorded as cause of death. Exposure, though, remains upstream and unrecorded.
And of course, the legal liability just goes right away. That's the whole point, right? Don't want to pay for everybody they're trying to murder all around the world, right? So the world's TB hotspots are disproportionately located in and around minting, smelling, fossil fuel, and heavy industrial regions. So, yeah, TB is counted as an infection. Mining is counted as economy. So that separates the two of them, right? And then let's talk about these funeral homes. Um, you know, every so often you read about some funeral home in this country doing something, well, I would consider it insane, right? Like they'll be caught with piles of bodies, or I remember one case wasn't really a funeral home, but it was some guy who was supposed to be scattering ashes of your beloved ones over the ocean. Well, he had a locker full of scattered ashes. So all these stories have always kind of caught my attention, right? And there's a reason for it. I mean, a very big reason for it. The U.S. treats funeral homes primarily as private businesses, not as part of a tightly regulated public health system. So, oversight of U.S. funeral homes is fragmented, weak, compliant driven, and underfunded. In many other countries, death care is regulated more like health care or civil administration, with routine inspections and centralized accountability. So, why funeral home regulation in the United States is so weak? Well, there's no strong federal oversight. There is no federal agency that regularly inspects funeral homes. Regulation is left to the states, and standards vary wildly. Some states inspect routinely, others only act after complaints or disasters. So problems are often discovered years too late after the bodies have started to pile up. So funeral homes are licensed as businesses, not health institutions. So they're regulated like any small service business, not like hospitals, laboratories, or morgues. So that means limited sanitation enforcement, minimal storage standards, few surprise inspections, little scrutiny of daily operations. In practice, a funeral home can operate for years without a meaningful inspection. And inspections are compliant based, not preventative. Most state systems work like this: no routine checks, no audits of body counts, no inventory reconciliation, no mandatory reporting of backlogs. Authorities often intervene only when neighbors smell decomposition, families demand bodies, employees report misconduct, or media exposes the situation. By then, dozens or hundreds of bodies may already be mishandled. So, funny thing about the funeral system here, right? One other story that I remember very distinctly, a guy was caught with all these body parts, and he was, well, the reason it's unregulated is like schools like Harvard, they make a lot of money. If you donate your body to science, that means cha-ching, cha-ching. Somebody's going to make a lot of money off your body. It's probably not going to go to anything that you think it's going to go to. It is, in fact, a money making machine. So, yeah, so this guy was selling all these parts, and then he was, what else was he doing? Oh, he got all the parts from a funeral home, and then Harvard got caught. They had a guy on the inside selling stuff. Of course, he was just a rogue guy, right? So you really think a guy inside the Harvard lab was just rogue selling body parts? No, he was the guy who got caught, right? He was the one who got punished. So, yeah, all these weird, weird stories about funeral home. 'Cause I've said for years, they're dumping stuff into our food, and I think a lot of it comes out of funeral homes. So, anyway, so in the U.S., death care is largely hidden from public view. Families trust funeral homes by default. Few people understand what standards should exist. This creates a low visibility industry, ideal for neglect to persist unnoticed. So, yeah. Why do the bodies pile up? Well, understaffed funeral homes, owners overwhelmed or incapacitated, or just outright criminals, financial collapse, mental health issues, fraud, charging families but not performing services, lack of refrigeration standards, no requirement to report unprocessed remains. Without routine oversight, failure compounds very silently. So, is this typical in other countries? Well, generally, no. Many countries regulate death far more strictly. Common features elsewhere: national standards, mandatory inspections, central registry of deaths and remains, government run morgues, direct public health oversight, immediate reporting of unclaimed or delayed remains. In some examples, several European countries treat funeral services as extensions of civil administration. Post mortem handling is often under municipal or national control. Long term storage of bodies without documentation is actually prohibited. That does not mean scandals never occur elsewhere, but they are rare and detected earlier. The funeral home problem mirrors other U.S. systems that I've also been analyzing. They privatize the responsibility. There's weak preventative oversight, reliance on paperwork over inspection, fragmented authority, action only after crisis, harm discovered after the bodies are accumulating. It's the same logic found in nursing homes, mental hospitals, environmental exposure, industrial health, and safety lapses. Exact same pattern. The reoccurring discovery of funeral homes with piles of bodies is not an accident and not just bad actors. It is the predictive outcome of a system where death care is privatized, oversight is weak, inspections are rare, responsibility is diffuse, accountability comes late. Other countries generally treat death as a public matter. The U.S. treats it as a private transaction. That difference explains the headlines. So, yeah, I just had a file on funeral homes and I just had to toss it here somewhere. So that's what you got to know about those funeral homes. Not very trustworthy, not at all. So, TB is the leading infectious cause of death around the world, outpaced only by the COVID-19 during the first 3 years of the pandemic. So I checked around. The sulfur TB connection has been made, but never consolidated into a single dominant theory and almost never framed as liability, relevant industrial causation. Instead, it appears fragmented across disciplines, time periods, and language. This fragmentation is itself part of the pattern that I've been tracing. So, physicians, epidemiologists, and industry hygienists repeatedly observed that sulfur and sulfur rich industry pollutants weaken lungs and increase TB susceptibility and severity. But no, this was never allowed to crystallize into a unified causal doctrine the way silicosis or asbestos mesothelioma did. The findings were instead absorbed into vague categories like air pollution, dust, irritant gases, smelter smoke, or urban miasma. So, but where does the sulfur TB link appear? But it's also very diluted. Early industrial medicine and smelter studies from the late 1800s to early 1900s. Physicians working near copper smelters, sulfuric acid plants, coal and metal refineries repeatedly noted the following: chronic bronchitis, lung irritation, high TB incident among exposed workers. Sulfur dioxide, that SO2, was explicitly identified as a major irritant, but framed as a predisposing factor, not a cause, and that language mattered. There was public health air pollution research going on from the 1900s to the 1940s. Urban health departments in London, Hamburg, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Chicago, they all of them linked coal smoke with high sulfur, acid fogs, smelter emissions. They were all linked to increased TB mortality. They were all linked to worse TB outcomes. They were all linked to higher infection activation rates. But the conclusion was typically phrased as air pollution lowers resistance to tuberculosis, not industrial sulfur exposure causes TB deaths. That distinction blocked any liability. So, mining medicine, especially metal mining, in hard rock mining literature, silica took center stage because it left visible lung scars. Sulfur gases were treated as secondary irritants, yet mine doctors repeatedly documented irritant gas exposure, sulfurous fumes, acid mist as worsening TB prognosis. TB was then listed as cause of death, not the exposure. There were animal and experimental studies in the mid 20th century. The laboratory work showed that sulfuric exposure damages the cilia, increases airway inflammation, impairs microphage function, reduces pulmonary immune defense. This mechanically explains why TB activates more readily, but these findings stayed in toxology, not TB policy. So, why sulfur never became the TB exposure, unlike silica? Because silica was recognized as an occupational disease. Asbestos had direct causation was accepted. Sulfur, though, the causation was fragmented. So sulfur lost the ubiquitous, the harder to isolate, multiple compounds, chronic diffuse injury, overlaps with urban air, fuel, smelters, and refineries, and it's politically catastrophic to assign the blame. Sulfur was everywhere, so it became nowhere. So I have a whole list of people, and they have documented different parts of this. One of them documented lung vulnerability and chronic irritation as precursors to TB severity. I have a whole list of them. U.S. Public Health Service published early 20th century reports noting industrial air's role in TB outcomes without assigning any fault. The British Medical Journal in the late 19th, early 20th century ran repeated discussions on smoke, sulfurous air, and TB susceptibility. World Health Organization, who are you going to call, continues to list air pollution as a major TB risk factor, but still non-specific. So the sulfur TB relationship exists in the record as predisposition, lowered resistance, aggravating factor, environmental stressor. Those phrases became the shields they needed for the cover up. So, what matters now? TB remains the leading infectious killer, concentrated in mining and industrial regions, closely aligned with sulfur heavy energy and extraction systems. Yet, sulfur exposure is still treated as a respiratory irritant, an air quality issue, a compliance problem, not a structural driver of TB mortality. So, yes, the TB sulfur connection has been observed for over a century. What never happened was unification. Instead, sulfur damage was scientifically acknowledged, administratively diluted, legally neutralized, diagnostically absorbed by TB. TB became the name of death. Sulfur remained the condition of life. So there were early quotations linking sulfuric acid to consumption. Very early medical writing in the 17th century even talked about it. This shows that sulfurous air was already a recognized environmental factor in discussions of consumption, which is that Poseidon stuff. This appears long before bacteriology, germ theory, or the sanatoriums. Air quality was already being discussed as something that could affect consumption illness. So they discussed it in different ways about the volcanoes. They discussed the ventilation. They have known about this for a very long time. And here's what you need to remember why sulfuric air disappeared from death certificates. This disappearance does not require denial or conspiracy. It follows directly from how death certification works. Death certificates record diseases, not causes upstream. Death certificates are designed to list the immediate cause of death, the underlying disease sequence. They are not designed to record environmental blame or exposure history. So even if people believed that sulfurous smoke aggravated the lungs, the certificate typically records tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and not smelter smoke, not coal sulfur, not sulfur dioxide. The formal that form itself filters the language right out of it. And occupation and industry are structured separately in the United States. Occupation and industry are separate fields, often completed by funeral directors, not integrated into the medical cause of death chain. This means that exposure information can exist, but never appears as the official cause of death. This is the mechanism of disappearance. Messy environmental language is converted into clean disease labels by the form and coding rules. So, TB terminology tightened over time. A 1903 public health paper on TB in England notes a shift in medical reporting, increasing practice to turn deaths as due to tuberculosis, which would formerly have returned as Poseidon, that's consumption stuff. So, why does this matter? As certification professionalizes and bacteriology consolidates, language narrows it down. Older descriptive terms like that facitis, bad air, smoke, or sulfurous lose space. They may persist in newspapers, testimony, or local memory, but not in official mortality statistics. So, has anyone seriously connected sulfur and TB? Yes, they have, but mostly in modern air pollution epidemiology, and the evidence is mixed. Some studies show positive associations between SO2 and other pollutants and TB outcomes or clinic visits. Other studies show negative or null associations in certain contexts. So, why does this actually strengthen this case? Well, it avoids a single cause harm. It supports a professional position, and that position is this: air pollution plausibly modifies TB risk and progression. Sulfur acts as a marker of combustion in industrial air mixtures. Effects vary by setting, co-pollutants, behavior, and measurement. This is consistent with both historical observation and modern science. So, in the 18th and 19th century, physicians and public health writers regularly discussed air, including sulfurous air, in relation to consumption or TB. As vital statistic systems develop, death certification increasingly required standardized disease entities like the fasciitis to the tuberculosis. This structurally displaced environmental descriptors from the official cause of death record. So, industrial and urban air mixtures, which were often sulfur laden from coal and smelting, could remain a lived reality while becoming administratively invisible. Modern epidemiology shows links between air pollution, including sulfur, and TB outcomes, make it reasonable to re examine TB history through an exposure sensitive lens without rewriting TB as a single cause industrial disease. So, sulfurous air was discussed alongside consumption long before modern medicine. What disappeared was not the exposure, but the language allowed on official records. TB became the name of death. Air quality became background. Industry vanished from the certificate. This is a known shift. So, what do they claim is the history of TB? Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the organism that causes the disease tuberculosis in humans. The disease has been infecting humans for thousands of years, according to them. Researchers found evidence of the disease 9,000 years ago in the evacuated remains of people who lived in the eastern Mediterranean region during that time. Reports of TB date back to around 410 to 400 BCE, when the physician Hippocrates termed the disease fasciitis, an archaical word that means a progressive of wasting away due to the way people with the disease become emaciated. And that's what happens. You become emaciated. And I've already explained why, but TB was also known as consumption for the same reason. Similarly, it was called the White Plague or White Death due to anemia from the disease, with people appearing pallid or chalky, leading to near certain death. Untreated active TB, meaning cases that are symptomatic, is highly lethal. About half of all people with untreated active TB die from the disease, whereas treatment reduces the death rate to 12%. And this, of course, is according to their Wikipedia page. I don't believe hardly any of it, right? I believe the part about the white part because, yeah, your white blood cell, it's hard to walk across a room. You get so weak. You get so thin, you think, oh, God, I'm just going to bowl over in a bag of bones. So, one of the most colorful phrases describing TB is the king's evil. This is a form of TB that causes neck swelling and lesions. Yeah, lesions, right? A condition called scrofula. During the Middle Ages, people believed that the touch of a king could cure a person from this form of TB through miraculous intervention. Finally, TB was ominously called the robber of youth due to its historical propensity to inflict people 15 to 30 years old. In 1865, Jean Antonio Villeme, an army physician in Paris, demonstrated that TB could be transmitted from infected animals to healthy ones through inoculation. Before these studies, the cause of TB was presumed to be primarily constitutional by either an inherent predisposition or from unhealthy or immoral lifestyles. The microorganism causing TB was ultimately discovered in 1882 by the German physician Robert Koch, Koch. Koch announced his findings on March 24th, 1882, a day globally recognized as World TB Day. So, according to them, how does TB spread? TB is spread by small infectious droplets in the air. A TB patient may emit these droplets by coughing, singing, or potentially from regular breathing that occurs during sleep or resting. Isn't this the same thing we heard about that virus? It's in the air. Watch out, they may cough on you. um, so, one form of TB can be spread through unpasteurized dairy products. Boy, we're really stretching here. While rare, there have been reports of TB transmission through bone grafts in which healthy donated bone material is used to replace damaged bones. The origin of the TB outbreak in Kansas remains unknown as of early March. I guess there was an outbreak in Kansas in March 2025. The outbreak has disproportionately affected those in low income communities, and 2 people have died from it. Well, that's a bunch of garbage. Anyway, um, so importantly, a patient with untreated TB can affect 10 to 15 others. Absolutely no way. No way this is true. So, and then there's a question, could COVID-19 pandemic be a factor? The COVID-19 pandemic has played a pivotal role in the resurgence of TB. Cases increased globally by 4.6% from 2020 to 2023, reversing decades of steady declines in the disease. In the U.S. alone, TB cases rose by more than 15% from 2022 to 2023. During mandatory shutdowns, people were less able to access healthcare centers for early diagnosis of TB or to fill prescriptions for treatment, perhaps due to the fear of contracting COVID-19 while visiting a medical care facility. Boy, they got a reason for everything, don't they? COVID-19 related disruptions in care resulted in nearly 700,000 excess deaths from TB. Access to healthcare may not be the only factor behind this uptick. Medical supply shortages and delays in shipment may have also played a role. For example, the U.S. experienced shortages of one of the primary TB drugs between 2021 and 2023. So now that we're on that question, what are the main treatments? This should be interesting, right? Multi drug treatment is currently the only way to cure TB and stop its spread. Prior to the 1930s, when the first antibiotic for TB was developed, TB treatments, including bloodletting and consumption of cod liver oil. The most popular treatment involved isolated sanatoriums in high altitude areas such as the Andes Rocks and the Rocky Mountains, where the cold, dry air was believed to be a cure. Scholars at the time suggested that the potential for cure was due to these environments being more invigorating for the body and providing more restful sleep. But there is no evidence to support these beliefs. So, streptomycin was the first antibiotic treatment to become available for TB in the 1940s. However, the microorganisms quickly became drug resistant. A second antibiotic called isoniazid was developed as a first line treatment against TB in the 1950s. Again, the microorganism became drug resistant. 2 and 4 drug combinations are now used to treat both latent infections and active disease. Well, if the disease doesn't get you, I bet you anything these pills will. Treatment of active TB requires at least 6 months of uninterrupted therapy. Disruptions in treatment result in further spread of TB and the emergence of multi drug resistance TB, which requires additional drugs and more than 9 months of treatment. But that said, all TB drugs are toxic. The quality of life for TB patients deteriorates during treatment and remains so throughout their lives. Boy, talk about an interesting cure, right? Finding cases and treating TB illness early before symptoms begin is important because it not only reduces the spread of disease, but also greatly reduces drug toxicity. Yeah, I would have to say the further the distance you can keep yourself from doctors and hospitals, the better off you're going to be. So, what should people be aware of? People should be aware that TB is still a public health problem across the entire globe. Education on the transmission, treatment, and need for active work to eradicate TB is the best defense. One of the reasons why education and awareness about TB are so important is that a person with latent TB may be unknowingly harboring the microorganism for years. In the absence of symptoms, these people are unlikely to seek care and will not be diagnosed and treated unless identified as part of the outbreak, as was the case for more than half of the patients over there in Kansas. Watch out, Kansas got it. You might get it next. So they claim that TB has existed for thousands of years and throughout its long history has been studied in myth and mystery more than any other disease. This is from an article I found, by the way. More than any other disease, it shaped and infused the social history of the 19th century. Its complexity, or I would say the lies, accompanied by a lack of scientific knowledge at the time, led to a paradoxical state of beauty and death. Tuberculosis is contagious and spreads most frequently through the air when the individual with active TB coughs or spits. The disease is commonly affects the lungs, but can affect other parts of the body, often progressing slowly, with symptoms potentially not manifesting until months or years after initial infection. Classic symptoms of TB of the lungs include fevers, night sweats, weight loss, and infamously chronic coughing and the spitting of sputum containing blood. Weight loss and the so called wasting away associated with TB led to the popular 19th century name of consumption, as the disease was seen to be consuming the individual. Although the earliest evidence of tuberculosis can be found in human remains over 9,000 years ago, it wasn't until the 19th and early 20th century that the disease reached its peak. And they claim it's because of crowding and blah, blah, blah. So, consumption was by no means an exclusive illness of the poor, but its easy method of transmission meant it crossed class boundaries and affected people of all levels of society. The drastic and damaging effect of this disease are undeniable, with nearly 4 million people said to have died as a result in England and Wales between 1851 and 1910, three-quarters of those from tuberculosis of the lungs. And yet, despite this, throughout the Romantic era and into the late 19th century, tuberculosis forged a unique place in society and became entwined with ideas of beauty and creativity. Numerous artistic figures contracted TB, shaping public perception of the disease. Famously, the poet John Keats, who had trained as a medical man, declared on seeing his blood-stained handkerchief after a coughing fit that it was his death sentence. I cannot be deceived in that color. That drop of blood is my death warrant. I must die. Romantic poet Lloyd Byron wished to die of consumption, declaring, how pale I look. I should like, I think, to die of consumption, because then the women would all say, see that poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying. Famed creatives like Keats became powerful symbols of the disease. They were seen to be the heightened sensibility, and it was thought that their work was elevated because of consumption's effect on the mind. When TB attacked young women in the upper classes, it was treated decidedly different than when it struck the poor. Unlike other serious illnesses of the time, pulmonary tuberculosis was associated with fragility and sexual attractiveness. So is TB the leading infectious killer today? That's the distinction. It's not the leading killer, it's the leading infectious killer. So, as the most recent global reporting, tuberculosis has again become the world's leading infectious cause of disease after a brief period when COVID-19 overtook it. During 2020 to 2022, COVID-19 exceeded TB mortality. By 2023-2024, TB reclaimed the top position globally. This is reported by the World Health Organization and reflects 10 million new TB cases per year worldwide. 1.2 to 1.4 TB deaths annually. TB mortality rising again and after COVID due to disrupted care, delayed diagnosis, worsening poverty and exposure conditions. So, TB is not just a historical problem, it is a present one. So, why the symptoms overlap so closely with sulfur exposure? This is the part that is hardest to ignore once you see it. It has core TB symptoms, chronic cough, shortness of breath, chest tightness, fatigue and weakness, weight loss, night sweats, neurological and mood changes, increased alcohol use for self medication, long term lung damage even after a cure, and the core sulfur dioxide exposure effects, airway irritation and chronic bronchitis, reduced lung capacity, persistent cough and air hunger, fatigue and systematic weakness, neurological symptoms, headaches, cognitive slowing, cardiovascular strain, increased vulnerability to infection, exasperation of anxiety and depressive symptoms. These are functionally indistinguishable in the symptom level. So, TB does not act in a vacuum. It is more likely to activate, more severe, more deadly when lungs are already damaged. Whereas sulfur compounds damage the cilia, cause chronic inflammation, impair immune response in lung tissue, and increase susceptibility to mycobacterial tuberculosis. So the real world pattern is often industrial lung injury to TB activation to death attributed to infection. Legally, only the last step is recorded. And TB remains concentrated in mining regions, smelting zones, refining corridors, areas with sulfur rich fuel combustion, poor housing near industrial sites. Modern TB maps still align with air pollution, industrial exposure, extraction economies. Yet TB is still framed primarily as an infectious disease, a compliance problem, a treatment adherence issue, not a sentinel marker of environmental lung damage. So, why is sulfur so especially important here? Sulfur exposure is widespread, is legally fragmented, multiple compounds, multiple industries. It produces diffuse chronic injury. It rarely leaves a clean biomarker trail. It weakens lungs without causing a single dramatic event. That makes it perfectly positioned to enable TB, be ignored in TB attribution, escape liability. This is structurally identical to what happened during the 19th century TB epidemic. So, TB is still the world's leading infectious killer. Its symptom profile overlaps almost exactly with chronic sulfur exposure. TB mortality continues to track environmental and industrial lung damage. The historical separation of infection from exposure remains in force. What changed is not the biology, it is the administrative framing. TB functions then and now as a masking diagnosis, real, deadly, and undeniable, yet still capable of absorbing and concealing underlying industrial harm. The consumption appearance entailed dramatically pale skin and ethereal thinness with red cheeks and a feverish glow. This became the defining fashionable aesthetics of the time, with women powdering their faces, some even using chemicals such as arsenic to achieve a paler complexion. This obsession with the consumption aesthetic peaked in the mid 1800s when corsets and volume of skirts further emphasized women's slender figures with damaging implications for women's physical health and social roles. The restricting nature of the corset made all but the smallest of physical tasks challenging, and excessive use could lead to displacement of internal organs. This traditional consumptive look was perpetuated throughout the popular culture with famous portraits, novels, plays, and operas telling tales of ethereally thin and beautiful women teetering close to death, or inspired creatives overcome with a disease. So yeah, they glamorized it, right? This consumption cultural trope has continued throughout to the modern day, meaning we're now almost trained to recognize the coughing of blood into a handkerchief in Act 1, meaning the inevitable death of that character by Act 3. Robert Koch's discovery of tuberculin bacillus in 1882 was a major event in the history of medicine. After centuries of speculation, Koch proved that the slow growing microorganism Mycobacterium tuberculosis caused the disease and established its contagious nature. The cause of so much death was boiled down to this single cell living organism. Once the cause of TB had been identified, its severity and contagious nature became better understood. Or when they talk about contagious neighbor, contagious area, well, yeah, maybe it might spread among a whole group of minors, children, or yeah, it could spread around groups that are already contained. I got to get over the word. Okay, let me just start over again here. So, as centuries progressed, the disease, once so clouded in romantic imagery and mystery, was revealed to be much more prosaic. Romantic portrayals and perceptions of consumption were gradually replaced with scientific facts, and the once mysterious disease was transformed into a public health problem. And that was when they built the first sanatorium as we mean it today, and that was founded in 1859. This is widely recognized by medical historians as the first purpose built sanatorium. The history TB could be treated or even cured through long term rest, high altitude fresh air, good nutrition, and sunlight. Patients lived there for months or years, not days. This was not a spa, but a controlled medical environment. This model became the template for sanatoriums across Europe and the United States. So it started off by the first one called the Falkenstein Sanatorium in 1876, and that introduced strict bed rest and it codified fresh air therapy. So that came to the United States in 1884. And this is where the rest, sun, and air doctrine become mainstream in America, eventually leading to state TB hospitals, children preventoria, massive public health infrastructure tied to isolation and long confinement. So, early civilizations did associate healing with rest, air, and sun. The ancient Greeks had healing temples, Roman baths, and convalescent villas, but these were not disease specific. They lacked long term residential isolation. They were not based on a unified medical theory of contagion or cure. The sanatorium was different. It merged medicine, architecture, discipline, and social control into one institution. So sanatoriums were sold publicly as natural, humane, restorative, but in practice, they also normalized long term isolation, shifted responsibility from environment and industry onto the patient, became tools for population management during industrialization. That dual role, care and control, is why sanatoria remain so relative when examining modern institutional health narratives. So, in the United States, they effectively operated these sanitariums from 1884 to 1960, 75 to 80 years. So the first one was 1884, rapid expansion 1900 to 1930, 1930 to 1940, peak years during the Depression. 1944 to 55, decline begins late. Yeah, then they introduced a psychiatrist around that time. So in the United States, listen to this, lots of places, there were 700 to 1,000 facilities nationwide. This count included state run TB sanatoriums, county and municipal TB hospitals, large private and charitable sanatoriums. If you include related institutions influenced by sanatorium logic, it was 1,500 to 2,000 total sites. Wow, that's a lot of people, right? Um, there was pre-atoria for at-risk children. There was long-term convalescent TB cottages. There were veterans TB hospitals. There were, of course, racially segregated colored sanatoriums in Jim Crow states. But the peak infrastructure, circa 1930, by the early 1930s, each U.S. state had at least one sanatorium. Most large cities had multiple TB hospitals. Many rural counties operated satellite facilities. Tens of thousands of patients were confined at any given time. Typical stays lasted months to multiple years. TB patients were often removed from employment, separated from families, confined under compulsory health authority. So, sanatoriums were not rare or marginal at all. They were one of the largest institutional health systems ever built in the United States, comparable in scale to psychiatric hospitals, state orphanages, and later veterans hospital systems. And they normalized the idea, this is very important, that environment plus behavior, not industrial exposure or labor conditions, were the primary causes of disease. So, 50, 75 to 80 years as a dominant system. The TB sanatoriums alone, 700 to 1,000 locations. Totally, there were 1,000 to 2,000 sites. The peak of these sanatoriums was 1900s to 1950s. I was born in 1951. I don't consider that long ago. So, when TB sanatoriums closed after antibiotics, millions of chronically ill people did not become healthy. And this is the catch here. They were reclassified medically, legally, and administratively into diagnostic categories that removed environmental, occupational, and state liability and placed responsibility on the individual. So it's all in your head. This was not a conspiracy event, it was a systematic transition across medicine, insurance, labor law, and welfare administrations. So, yeah, Phase 1, sanatoriums collapse 1945 to 1955, triggered by the antibiotics. So long-term confinement was no longer medically justified. Whoops, they were the ones who cooked up the antibiotics thing, so it kind of got them out of business, right? So what was the structural effect? Well, states shut down or repurposed TB facilities in mass. Chronic patients with lung damage, fatigue, neurological symptoms, alcohol dependence, behavioral changes were discharged without a new institutional home. So, what disappeared? Well, state acknowledgement of environmental disease. Government maintained records tying illnesses to housing, industrial exposure, mining, military service, and poor sanitation. So, phase two, 1952 to 1965, they absorbed it all into psychiatry. Boy, funny how that works, right? The early inflection points that DSM-1 and DSM-2 formalized broad free categories. So what changed? Well, symptoms previously tolerated as post-infectious or environmental injury were reframed as psychoneurotic disorders, character disorders, personality disturbance, chronic anxiety, somatization. So, why this matters legally? Well, psychiatry does not require a causal agent. No mind, no chemical, no employer. Liability cannot be traced backwards to industry or state policy. Treatment responsibility shifts to the individuals, their families, and the county mental health systems. So then we go to phase three, 1948 to 1970, alcoholism as moral medication hybrid. So, alcohol use common among TB survivors with lung pain, insomnia, and neurological damage was then reframed as a behavioral disease or a moral failing with a medical gloss. There was a critical shift. Alcoholism becomes separatable from the cause, not a response to pain or toxic injury, not a workplace or military injury, but a choice or condition. So the outcome employers, insurers, and governments avoid disability compensation, occupational disease claims, long term care responsibility. And then the 1960s to the 1980s, the personal responsibility doctrine by administrative logic. By the time large institutions closed, the state had already shifted its stance from custodian to regulator, from cause to compliance. Health narratives hardened into lifestyle choice, poor coping, addition, non-compliance, secondary gain, legal consequence. And courts increasingly required proof of intentional harm or a single cause exposure, which chronic diffuse illness cannot satisfy. So, yes, the fix was in at that point, but sanatoriums closures did not end illness. They ended a legal framework that acknowledged environmental and exposure. What replaced it was a diagnostic system optimized for managing people, not assigning responsibility. And this is where Kirkbridge Mental Hotels, hospitals fit into that thing. So yeah, um, perfect because TB patients with fatigue, weight loss, mood changes, cognitive repair. If the physical disease was ambiguous, they could now say it's psychiatry should deal with it. If contagion was suspected, they say, well, take him to the sanatorium. This allowed the state to sort illnesses by legal risk, not by cause. So 1945 to 1965, post sanatorium closures. When TB sanatoriums closed, who went where? Chronic respiratory damage, they became outpatient medicine with minimal support. Neurological behavior or non-compliant patients went to state mental hospitals. Pain managed patients using alcohol went to psychiatrists and alcoholism clinics. Mental hospitals became the default absorber for illnesses without a single provable cause. Symptoms tied to poverty, labor, or exposure. People who could no longer work reliably. So that made why were the Kirkbride hospitals legally convenient? Mental hospitals did not require proof of causation, and that is so key. They can just say, well, you're crazy, but they're not going to tell you how you got crazy, right? They operated under police powers, not labor law. Mental hospitals also converted health claims into custodial issues. Once a patient entered psychiatry, industrial exposure records stopped. Worker compensation claims failed. Families, not states or employers, became responsible. This is why psychiatry expanded precisely as sanatoriums were contracting. So they claim that architectural symbolism matters here. Kirkbride buildings were monumental, isolated, self contained, designed for long stays. They visually and administratively normalized disappearance out of the labor force, out of legal processes, out of public accountability. This is why many were later reused as prisons, state offices, universities, luxury housing. The function remained, but the building stayed the same. So this is often missed. The early asylum logic. Environment can damage the mind. Mid-century psychiatric logic was this: the mind generates disorder internally. And that pivot preserved confinement, eliminated environmental blame, and neutralized liability. So, yes, Kirkbride mental hospitals made the sanatorium system survivable after TB ended. They allowed the state to keep managing surplus illness while erasing environmental, industry, and policy as causes, and reframing suffering as mental, moral, or personal failure. That handoff is one of the most important and least acknowledged transitions in U.S. public health industry. So, yeah, I have a couple of examples. I have a lot more on my website if you'd like to take a further look yourself. And this is exactly why I had the backflip moment, because I thought, my God, all these symptoms sound exactly sound exactly like sulfur. Well, that's exactly because they are the same. I'm going to put this on hold for right now. Okay, and wrapping this up, what I've been doing is naming sulfur exposure as a missing variable and TB as a legal medical shield. I don't believe this is fringe. Everybody else has been documenting different parts of this. Because what happens with historians avoid saying what I'm saying because of professional risk. What do I have to risk, right? Naming TB as a legal medical shield implies that public health was not merely mistaken. It shows that diagnostic categories were strategically useful, and eugenics operated administratively, not rhetorically. And industrial harm was knowingly displaced onto bodies. And modern environmental health laws inherited this architect. So what happens is that when you're a professional historian or something like that, well, you have to follow certain guidelines, and you can't be going around and crossing over different things. So if your classification is, let's say, um, like for example, no single discipline owns a whole causal chain. Like scholars like Michel Foucault showed that power survives by distributing itself across domains so that each actor can plausibly say, that part is not my responsibility. When no one holds the whole diagram, no one names the structure. And also, primarily, most doctors are single organ. That way, they don't seem to care what other doctors are giving you as far as pills and all that because they only study that organ. Well, I don't know. I'm just your kidney doctor. How would I know that your liver's failing? So, anyway, so that also converts things. So because I'm not part of a system, I'm not part of their universities, no one is telling me what I could write or can't write, so I can merge over those lines that other people can't do it. So, and well, remember, I'm also being killed with sulfur exposure in my own home for my views and my reporting on these subjects. So, yeah, I think you can get away with it if you're part of that community. You're a historian, you write books, you get, materials and funding to write those books and stuff. So, yeah, of course, you're going to stay out of certain areas because, well, it's not my area, right? Just like a doctor can say, hey, kidneys really aren't my thing. I'm more into your eyes. So that's how it all works. So what I'm going to be doing is closing off here. I have another show, my second backflip for this week. I'm trying to finalize my shows while I still can. And I backflipped over this other one. So it is a big, 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 huge one. So be safe out there and goodbye for now. I think we've learned all we need to learn about sulfur and TB. Pretty big trick if you ask me. So what are we going to do about it? I don't know. Not much I can do about it. The thing will be in your hands if you care to share the information or do whatever you want to do. But remember, the trick is in because they had to explain this, just like they had to say that smoking was bad years ago because they knew that on the horizon, hey, they could then blame smoking for all these lung disorders, right? So be safe out there and goodbye for now.